Hello, and welcome to MDIC's annual public forum. During today's session, NESTcc Research Network Director Robbert Zusterzeel will be joined by representatives from FDA, Northwest EHealth Limited, Evidation Health, and RAND to discuss perspectives on real-world evidence assessing its use, impact, and role in the United States and European Union. Please make sure to join in the conversation on Twitter by following at MDIC Annual Forum and using the hashtag MDICAPF2020. Now, please welcome session moderator Robbert Zusterzeel.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our session today on perspectives on real-world evidence and assessing its use, impact, and role in the United States and Europe. I'm Robbert Zusterzeel. I'm the Research Network Director for the National Evaluation System for Health Technology, or NEST, Coordinating Center. That's an initiative of MDIC. So while we go through the presentations today, please feel free to type up your question in the Q&A box at the bottom. Today we have an esteemed panel of speakers that will be talking about the use, the impact, and role of real-world evidence from different stakeholder perspectives. To put us all on the same page, what is real-world data and what is real-world evidence? So real-world data is data generated in the routine course of care rather than during pre-market research or clinical trials that takes into account real patient experiences. When that real-world data is then analyzed appropriately and is fit for purpose, we can turn it into real-world evidence. Real-world evidence are insights gleaned from real-world data that have the potential to inform and empower patients, accelerate medical device innovation, and improve healthcare outcomes. The NEST Coordinating Center was initiated in the end of 2016 through a grant from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration with the mission to accelerate the development and translation of new and safe health technologies, leveraging real-world evidence and innovative research, with the vision to be the leading organization within the health technology and medical device ecosystem for conducting efficient and timely, high-quality real-world evidence studies throughout the total product lifecycle. And to achieve that vision, NEST works together with stakeholders across the medical device ecosystem, which is what you see here on the right, which include regulators, health systems, patient groups, industry, clinician groups, and payers. It's important to understand that the NEST Coordinating Center serves a dual role within the medical device ecosystem. First, as a coordinating center, offering services to organizations seeking to sponsor medical device and technology research based on high-quality real-world data. And on the other hand, as a collaborative community, designated as such by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. It's comprised of representatives from across the medical device ecosystem, including the FDA, working together to coalesce teams of diverse stakeholders around common needs and initiatives within the medical device ecosystem. In working with all these ecosystem stakeholders, NEST has really been able to drill down on the interests and motivations that each of these stakeholders have in working with real-world data and real-world evidence. So I won't spend too much time on this slide, knowing that we'll be hearing from the other panelists around the interests, motivations, and use of real-world data in the industry, by payers, regulators, as well as patient organizations and for patients. My final slide, I want to introduce NEST version 1.0, which was launched on June 30th, 2020. This is the first operational version of the NEST Coordinating Center, which means that NEST is open for management of sponsor-funded research using its large research network of high-quality real-world data and expert investigators, potentially serving all ecosystem stakeholders. If you're interested in working with NEST to figure out what your research needs are and how we can help you, please go to our website and let us know or send us an email.
Hello, everyone. I'm Justin Timby, Senior Health Policy Researcher from RAND, and I will be sharing today some of the highlights from a landscape assessment that we recently conducted on behalf of the NEST Coordinating Center. And the study was really designed to describe how real-world evidence was being used throughout the medical device industry for regulatory and coverage decisions, and to identify the challenges and opportunities to improve use of real-world evidence. So one of the main takeaways from our study is that manufacturers are enthusiastic about using real-world evidence, but are really still in an exploratory stage. So we fielded a survey to members of medical device associations, And on that survey, we learned that really only about 30% of manufacturers are at least sometimes using real-world data recently for indication expansions. Slightly higher, nearly 2/3 for other use cases like post-market surveillance. But for pre-market uses, manufacturers told us in follow-up interviews to the survey that we conducted that they're really starting to form partnerships, characterize data sets, explore linkages, and are really only testing the waters in terms of current research. And actually, many manufacturers are using the NEST test cases and demonstration projects to explore potential uses of real-world evidence. There have been relatively few regulatory submissions to date. But despite the low submission activity, manufacturers are overwhelmingly supportive of pre-market use cases for real-world evidence. Nearly 2/3 indicated that real-world evidence can play a role from their perspective for initial PMA approvals, and nearly 90% for indication expansions. We asked about challenges using real-world evidence, and they really fell into two major categories. Among sort of the organizational challenges, despite the potential for favorable return on investment, there can be a high cost of acquiring real-world data and especially linking data sources. Getting traction with new data partners that may be required to access high quality or large scale real world data sources can also be a problem, typically more of a problem for smaller companies. Also, smaller companies may lack staff with real world expertise in-house. In terms of the challenges using the data itself, I think many of you participating today are familiar with some of these challenges. Which really do apply to multiple data sources, real-world data sources. I think one of the challenges that we heard most about, or not necessarily most about, but was fairly frustrating to respondents that we interviewed was control of registry data collection. And that manifested itself in a couple of ways. Manufacturers were frustrated by their inability to encourage follow-up data collection at high levels within external registries. And they also reported frustration with timely access to data from registries for fulfilling reporting requirements, such as for post-approval studies. Another challenge that emerged was around the concept of fit for purpose and whether real-world evidence is fit for purpose. And so despite the 2017 guidance from CDRH, in which there weren't a lot of detailed examples of success stories, manufacturers are really looking for these success stories to help guide them in their efforts. One of the areas that manufacturers that participated in our interviews described as being very helpful was the NEST data quality and methods frameworks, which really helped to address some of these fit-for-purpose challenges with clear, concrete, step-by-step guidance. Many manufacturers are taking advantage of pre-submission meetings to meet with FDA about real-world evidence. Those meetings are helpful, but they don't necessarily allow ongoing dialogue, which may be required, particularly for novel or newer real-world data sources that do require a lot more interaction with FDA. And another common theme that we heard is that there really is this learning curve really on both sides for manufacturers and CDRH. There was sort of mention of variability in the review process, but also an acknowledgement that CDRH is really taking efforts to improve consistency in the review process when it comes to real-world evidence. As part of the study, we conducted 4 case studies in which real-world evidence was used in successful regulatory decisions. And you can see in the box to the right that the 4 case studies covered a wide range of different device types. They were all used in the context of indication expansions, which I think reflects the kinds of submissions that CDRH is currently seeing. And we were really conducting these case studies to identify common themes around successful uses of real-world evidence. And some of the findings from those case studies are listed here. I won't go through all of these, but really a couple of the key findings are that these uses really relied on strong baseline safety and effectiveness data for the initial indication. And in each of these cases, these were all indication expansions. The jump to the new indication really was not substantial. It wasn't requiring a major leap of faith. The data collection and analysis methods in these case studies were quite robust. Some of these case studies relied on high quality registries like the Vascular Quality Initiative. Others relied on robust existing data collection systems, such as for infections in dialysis facilities. We also conducted a number of interviews with payers who reported that they do use real-world evidence in coverage decisions, but there are some caveats. So payers typically view real-world evidence as a complement to pivotal study data, typically clinical trial data, but real-world evidence does play an important role in questions relating to long-term durability, long-term safety of medical devices. Payers told us that they really do evaluate real-world evidence in much the same way that they evaluate other forms of evidence, and really sense some frustration about the label real-world evidence because it's, to many payers, evidence is evidence. But payers do have some concerns about data quality and the analytic methods in current real-world evidence, and are typically looking for more rigorous, more robust studies using real-world evidence. A clear and consistent finding that we heard from both payers and manufacturers is that unpublished real-world evidence really isn't going to affect coverage decisions. Payers really are looking for the peer review process to establish that scientific validity that comes through that process. And then I'll just close with a few opportunities for ways of strengthening use of real-world evidence, both for regulators and manufacturers. I won't go through all of these, but just highlighting a couple. More specific and updated guidance is something that manufacturers are looking for, and this could be developed in the form of lessons learned from the last couple of years that really highlight exemplary data collection approaches, but also pitfalls that manufacturers should avoid. More examples of successful uses of real-world evidence covering a broader set of use cases. Improved tracking of real-world evidence could help show how the field is advancing and also give more motivation to manufacturers. Just focusing on the manufacturer side, there are opportunities for companies to get involved with any number of real-world evidence-related initiatives sponsored by FDA, MDIC, NEST, and can provide input in some of these documents like NEST's frameworks that were envisioned as living documents and refined over time. Establishing strategic partnerships to expand access to real-world data sources is also a priority for manufacturers. And then to address some of the concerns of payers, improving the rigor of study designs and methods could be helpful in moving forward real-world evidence, particularly focusing on strong designs such as pragmatic clinical trials. And then coverage with evidence development is a strategy that may address some of the concerns covering products initially from the perspective of payers. We didn't hear a lot about CED policies outside of Medicare, but revisiting these policies, which may be a particularly good fit for real-world evidence, may deserve further consideration.
I'm Daniel Caños, the Director of the Office of Clinical Evidence and Analysis within CDRH inside the Office of Product Evaluation and Quality. I'll be providing CDRH's perspective on clinical evidence generation, discussing its use in regulatory decision-making, and FDA's role in the wider stakeholder community. Real-world evidence data sources can include diagnostic lab and imaging data, unique device identifiers, device-generated data, medical records, patient-reported outcomes, and we're also seeing beginnings of integration of patient preference information into real-world evidence sources such as registries. Traditional clinical trials evaluate device performance in controlled settings. Definitely have benefits with respect to control over the study design and protocol, and as well as tight control over confounding. However, they do have limitations such as the cost and the time associated with constructing these studies and breaking them down and rebuilding the structure all over again, as opposed to taking advantage and leveraging existing clinical evidence generation sources. They also, it's difficult to collect rare outcomes within these clinical trials. And there is at times questions of generalizability of the study findings. So why use RWE and RWE in regulatory decision making? Well, it provides a better understanding of device performance within the real world environment, which can further inform the benefit risk profile. It also facilitates the collection of outcomes that are not always feasible to collect in clinical trials, such as the performance in diverse patient populations, and also within subgroups. It allows for longer-term outcome assessment, and it provides an ability to assess those rare outcomes as a result of tapping into larger data sets. It provides opportunities to partner with patients in new ways. As I mentioned, obtaining patient-reported outcomes, leveraging mobile medical apps, wearable devices, user experience, and allows for reduced time and cost to answer important questions. As I mentioned, leveraging existing infrastructure and building upon that, as opposed to having a one-time clinical trial and then tearing down an infrastructure and having to rebuild each time you have a new study. CDRH's journey down the road of real-world evidence began as early as 2010 with the launch of the Medical Device Epidemiology Network, or MDEPINet, as you heard Justin refer to. Followed by that, FDA then had a proposal for a national evaluation system for medical devices. FDA first awarded funding to the NEST Cornea Center, or NESTcc, in 2016. And then we issued our guidance on RWE that next year. Since that time, FDA has been working with NEST and the wider stakeholder community on the test cases, providing input on the data quality and methods frameworks referred to previously. And we're excited to see the launch of version 1.0, as Robbert discussed. So CDRH is supporting and advancing real-world evidence through our total product lifecycle reviews. Since fiscal year 2015, CDRH has granted marketing authorization for more than 65 new or modified Class 2 and Class 3 medical devices using RWE. CDRH believes so much in total product lifecycle assessment and real-world evidence that we actually underwent a reorganization to support this approach. Part of that reorganization was the creation of the office, which I direct, the Office of Clinical Evidence and Analysis, where we put together the components of biostatistics, clinical trial policy, operations, bioresearch monitoring, epidemiologist, real-world evidence assessment, and the MedSun outreach and partnerships program work, so that we can really have within one office the kind of the powerhouse of clinical evidence generation to support the clinical trial venture and provide that support to the Office of Health Technologies, the OHTs being the ones that review this evidence. And so in so doing, working towards consistency of approaches and also exchange of information and experience with uses of real-world evidence, and really have that free-flowing expertise throughout the center. Experts within CDRH provide support and training on good clinical practice, data quality, study design, analytic methodology, and knowledge of specific real-world data sources. We also are engaged in infrastructure and network development with professional societies and payers, as well as groups to develop policies such as CITI, AVAMED, also working with CEDAR, and within the NEST Coordinating Center. Just last September, FDA announced our participation in the NEST Coordinating Center collaborative community to work together with the multi-stakeholder community to help develop methodologies and systems designed to drive down the time and cost of real-world data collection and analysis. And it also increases the value and the use of real-world data evidence to meet the needs of patients, payers, the medical device industry, healthcare professionals, and other regulatory bodies. NEST Coordinating Center has developed a strong and growing network of collaborators, enabling access to a wide swath of evidence from clinical experience, which can be harnessed to support regulatory submissions within version 1.0 as described earlier by Robbert. The pathway to use of real-world evidence is not without its own challenges, as Justin described in his report. In August 2017, FDA released the use of real-world evidence to support regulatory decision-making for medical devices guidance to clarify how we evaluate real-world data to determine whether they are sufficient for generating the types of real-world evidence that can be used in FDA regulatory decision-making for medical devices. This is a great initial start, and as Justin mentioned, there's with the time and experience, there's more information that could be put into the guidances and updated to provide more relevant data that based upon our experiences. And earlier this year, NEST Coordinating Center published the methods framework, defining the key components of a study protocol for the evaluation of medical devices, and also the data quality framework covering data governance, characteristics, and capturing the transformation and curation of data. As I mentioned, these represent a very good starting point for the community, and they're all works in progress. Sharing our current thinking at that time. This future work can provide, in the revisions of these documents, can provide further clarity, as I mentioned, and how to assess or characterize potential fit for purpose and of different data sources for specific questions. Further, a roadmap covering how we can use these systems as well as an access surveillance capabilities to monitor for early safety signal identification can actually help as far as leverage the system. The system is under development, and which we and further tools will be issued later this year that will really help to map out that roadmap for how the NEST Coordinating Center can be leveraged for that active surveillance capabilities. So in combination of the evolving data quality and methods framework documents, reassessing the FDA real-world evidence guidance documents, as well as developing a roadmap for active surveillance, will really further lighting up this pathway for how we use real-world evidence. Additionally, FDA is working on the publication highlighting success stories for medical devices utilizing real-world evidence for regulatory decision-making to provide more examples for the stakeholder community and further illuminate that pathway for the use of real-world evidence. FDA is here to help and facilitate engagement around real-world evidence through our participation in the NEST Coordinating Center collaborative community, connecting with test case principal investigators to maximize the project relevance for regulatory decision-making, in addition to the pre-submission meetings that are already part of the process. Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to be here. My name is Martin Gibson, and I am the CEO of Northwest EHealth. I'm also a clinician, and my background is endocrinology with specialization in diabetes. And that's relevant because diabetes is a very data-rich specialty, which lends itself to real-world data analysis. And indeed, many of the things that we grew came out of diabetes in the UK. And I'm going to give very much the UK perspective on what data are available, how we might use them, how we indeed have used them to support regulatory studies. We grew our systems out of the need to do pharma studies, but we're now moving into using the same technology for supporting device and diagnostic studies. So the most famous thing I guess we've done that people may have heard of is something called the Salford Lung Study, which was done with GSK, which was the first large-scale phase 3B trial of a medication that proved the effectiveness of that medicine in over 7,000 people using just electronic health record information. So we've got some pedigree in being able to do this, and some of the scars that go with it as well. I think one of the things that I would like to say right at the start is that the big challenge for all of us is that it's difficult to get hold of data sometimes. I always have 3 things that I say that you need to do around data. You need to show that the data actually exist in terms of real world data, because if they don't exist, you haven't got a study. Can you actually get hold of that data? Are there any restrictions on access to it? Often there are. Sometimes it's on a piece of paper rather than electronically available, and that's no use. Sometimes there are governance restrictions on your access to that information, which would prevent you from doing it. And then finally, when you do get hold of the information and the data, is it actually any good? Is it actually fit for the purpose that you need to use it for? So there's those 3 things that you always have to answer. Does it exist? Can you get hold of it? Is it any good? Let's assume that you can actually do all of those 3 things. So the slide that I'm showing you now is that it takes really too long to get from the left-hand side to the right-hand side. And what we're trying to do with using some of these technologies is to shrink that and make it more cost-effective and bring new products to market sooner for the benefit of patients. Everything has to go through at the top left there, a discovery and development phase, and then a clinical testing program, and the regulators are looking for that. But increasingly payers are looking for evidence of value, and there's an overlap between these 2 areas that real world data and real world evidence can help answer. Somewhere in the middle of that, you're allowed to start selling the product. But underneath that is what data sources are you going to use? And you can use different kinds of data to answer different questions. A lot of the information that has been used historically around real world evidence is using anonymized or pseudonymized data and looking at that observationally over time. And that definitely has utility. However, as Justin and then Daniel have said, sometimes all of the data that you might want aren't actually in the data set. You might need to supplement the data. And one of the ways that you can do that is to reach out to patients, and I'm sure Bray's going to talk about this some more, and get information directly from individuals. To do this, one needs to have consent really, and that's the area that we specialize in, using identifiable consented data to inform real world trials. So it's an extra, and I apologize for this, it's just an extra piece of terminology. We've talked about real world data, we've talked about real world evidence, and I'm talking about real world trials. But it's all using electronic health information systems. Once you've got this information, and once you've got the correct approvals in place, this becomes a very powerful system, not only for evaluating the product, but also for long-term follow-up and cohorts. And what is often referred to in the US in terms of registry data is a little bit different in the UK. And I'll show you in a minute why the UK is a little bit different from that perspective. But once you've got it set up, you can look at things in the long term very cost effectively. So I'm going to show you one of the tools that we've done for helping design, find and recruit patients, which is called Farsight, which is one of the tools mentioned at the bottom of this slide. But it's only one of many tools that are available across the UK, and wouldn't claim to have a monopoly on this, but it allows you to access the data and help design your trials or implementation very quickly. Here's an example of one of these tools called Farsight, which is around designing the study, finding the people that you want to participate in the study, and then recruiting them to the study. And I'm just looking here at a very small data set. We have access with this particular system to very soon around about 5 million people. And we've run a sister project with this using national data on 50 million people. So you can see there's a little section there that says researcher view. And in this, the researcher is looking at anonymized data. So you can refine your search criteria, design your study, see if the patients really do exist that would be useful to help you with your trial, and whether the numbers add up. So the example here, if you can read any of the small print, is a study looking for people with diabetes who are on a statin who have a total cholesterol level of a certain level. And you can see the numbers go down from 200,000 down to 4,000. And that's an example of, and the speed with which I'm telling you about this particular slide is the speed at which you can do this analysis. It's very, very quick. What you can then do at the top right is see, well, where are those patients? Which primary care centres, which general practitioners are those patients aligned to? Once you've picked the ones that have the sufficient numbers to help you with your study, you can send a link through to those primary care providers that are in the system. They open up their version, and then on the left-hand side, you've got the GP view, and this is dummy data, but it gives the example of now re-identifying all of those patients. And the system has built into it the ability to recruit those patients directly through mail or text messaging or other methods. So it's a very quick system for designing, seeing if you can do something with the data. So that's, does the data exist question, do the patients exist? Can you get hold of them? And then you can recruit them. So that's just a find, recruit and system. But we equally in the UK have a number of platforms that we can run the trials on. I mentioned the Salford Lung study. That was one of the first studies to utilize that platform. Let me tell you about UK data in a little bit more detail and what you can do, which is a little bit different to what might be possible in the US. One of the things that makes life a lot easier in the UK is that we all have something called an NHS number, a National Health Service identifier. It's a unique identifier. It's assigned to you when you're born and you keep it until you die. And that means that whatever disparate data set your data end up in, if it's aligned with an NHS number, it's much easier for us to bring that information together and be assured that it is the same individual you're talking about. And that sort of short circuits a whole load of problems that are not easily solvable in areas that don't have a unique identifier. So the data, however, are spread across a number of systems. We talk about a National Health Service in the UK, and it is, but it is actually made up of about 13,000 separate organisations, all working under a similar framework. So the data is still very fragmented, just like they would be in the US. But we have this unique identifier to bring them together. So let's talk about data quality, because it's one of the things that Robbert was talking about. Which data are good, which not so good, and what can you and can you not do? So on this particular slide is something that is our system that brings data together into our trial platform, but it gives you an idea moving from left to right clockwise. We have our GPs. Now, GP data in the UK is extremely high quality. They've been using electronic health records since the mid-1990s, and it's very well coded. Not for everything, but we're aware of what's good and what's not so good. One of the things that is very good is around prescribing. Prescribing data is excellent. So we know when the drug was prescribed by the GP, when it was dispensed by the pharmacy, the duration, the number of medications, and so on. So GPs, pharmacy data, very good. Hospital data, unlike the US, is very patchy. Whereas there's been federal investment in the US to have EHRs in most hospitals, that is not the case in the UK. I would estimate around 20% of hospitals have got decent systems. So you have to kind of pick and choose which parts of the country you'd be able to do this in. But again, we have expertise in that. There are then national data sources that you can tap into. And if this is where it says NHS Digital at the top, and there are different NHS Digital data sets. All of those are available nationally, from health episode statistics through the Office of National Statistics that tells you about deaths and cause of death. And indeed, there are other repositories of data that are more specialized. For example, the National Institute for Cardiovascular Outcome Research, something like NICOR, will have data specifically around cardiovascular outcomes. And all of these can be brought together. Increasingly also community services, social care, as I'm sure Bray's going to talk about, getting information from individuals, from smart devices, wearables, and so on, are now starting to flow into the system as well. So what you have across the UK then is this incredible ability to track somebody from birth all the way through potentially to death, with all of that data potentially lined up, and not always easy to get hold of. It's not straightforward. And so there are a few parts of the country that have got their act together to do this at scale. We're working with Northwest London, with one of the Health Data Research UK hubs, and we're based in Manchester in the UK. So we cover about 10% of the population between those two of England. But there are other systems and services available, but I hope I've given you an overview of what is possible with a national healthcare system and longitudinal data. And we hope very much to be part of the NEST family in providing access to that. Thank you.
Wow, Martin, thank you so much for inspiring us all. I think almost daily about moving to the UK, and now you're really, really pushing it for us. So I'm Bray Patrick Lake, and I am the Director of Strategic Partnerships for Evidation Health, but probably most importantly, I am a patient representative on the front lines who is living with medical devices. If you count them individually, I think I'm up to 30 different implanted devices if we want to separate them out by cardiac devices, stents, and individual coils. And I've spent the last decade really fighting for a more patient-centered approach to medical product development and surveillance. And I've had the pleasure of serving on different task forces like MDIC and working with NEST, and also being a stakeholder advisor on efforts like the TVT registry for valvular technologies. But today I'm here to speak to you about my role at Evidation Health. So Evidation is a health technology company that provides real-world evidence to life sciences companies. And we do this by enabling anyone to participate in groundbreaking research and health programs. And so our model is direct to participant. So we have a trusted relationship with about 4 million individuals in 9 out of 10 zip codes across the US. And this is really important because it's a different model of just going direct to the participant and individually permissioning their different data. And so really our approach is all outside of clinic, which is very complementary and interesting, I think, when you think about the approach of NEST and what Robert's talking about with real world data being collected in the course of clinical care. Evidation is really taking an approach that is completely opposite and outside of the clinical care experience. So traditionally patients, we're measured very episodically. You can look at these snapshots when we come into clinic. And I'm now doing so well that I honestly am trying not to go to so many appointments and trying not to go into clinics. And so what happens is we have all these things that are really invisible and very limited, and don't really talk much and speak to, with the data story, what it's like to live with our condition in everyday life, and what is the true burden of disease, what are our outcomes, how well are we doing living with these devices that have been implanted in our bodies. And it's really important for us to take a new approach and really get outside of the clinic and start to better understand how patients feel, function, and survive on a daily basis. So we at Evidation very much work to the broader definition of real world data that was developed by Duke Margolis Health Center, Health Policy Center, and a real world evidence stakeholder advisory group. So using the definition for person-generated health data, which is a form of wellness and health-related data created, recorded, or gathered by individuals for themselves or by family members or caregivers. So there is just data flowing in our lives on a daily basis. And as you guys know, like so many people have smartphones, like it's a very broad uptake of smartphone across the country. And it's one of the most powerful tools that we can use to really understand activity. We can understand gait, we could understand gait speed, we could understand speech, social interactions. And then we've got all of these different sensors and devices, consumer wearables and clinical grade devices, and then certainly the opportunity to structure and capture some of this data through electronic patient-reported outcomes and surveys. So we're generating all this data all the time, and it tells us a lot about our health. And this is very much aligned. I so appreciated Commissioner Gottlieb's really commitment to modernizing FDA and innovating and taking in this new type of data and really understanding how it complements the existing traditional sources of data that we're capturing in electronic health records and through the clinical experiences. But mobile technologies and the EPROs can really complement this and start to generate objective and continuous activity and physiologic data, which again will just tell a much more complete story of how a person is living with disease and or medical products. So what this looks like, if you're looking at the image on the left-hand side of the screen, it's a very incomplete picture of who I am on a daily basis. Again, if you're just looking at these traditional sources, but you can individually permission, ask people what they're willing to share, consent them for research, and then start to get a much more rich and robust picture of their functional mobility, exacerbations in disease or conditions, how and when they're using medical products. So if we just look traditionally at claims data, we can see that a device was implanted or a drug was prescribed, but it doesn't tell us how patients are using drugs and devices. How frequently are they using them? Are they using properly? So we need to start capturing all this other data. And when you do that, so we can start doing this in a longitudinal, continuous fashion. You can more deeply phenotype patient populations, which is important for natural history. You can then start to precision target clinical trials. So we can start to identify who are the patients that should be in the trial. I'll share an example. I was in a migraine trial for an implanted cardiac device. Idea was close a hole in the heart, migraines and strokes are prevented. I run an online community for patients. And so we knew that the screening criteria for the trial was basically that you had to have 11 days or more migraine a month to qualify the trial. And patients really wanted to have access to this new technology and this new device. So what do you think happened in the screening? Yeah, I had at least 11 migraines, I had 12. Well, if you start using some of this objective data from wearables, you can actually see physiologically what happens when a person says they're having a migraine. So patients self-report, are you having migraine? Yes. When you start to look at that objective data, you can see that their heart rate went up, their activity went down, they reported photophobia, and they reported nausea. All this is objective data that just really helps us target and do a better job of actually screening for clinical trials to make sure that the patients that are supposed to be in the trials are actually in those trials. We can also start to develop measures that matter. The trial that I was in, we measured stroke and death. That's great, I haven't had a stroke, I'm still alive, but it doesn't tell me how I am living with this device in real life. And I've also exceeded, the time limit of what they thought. After 5 years, a patient would do this. I'm now on 12 years, and I'm doing really well, but we're not capturing any of this data. And it would be really terrific to be able to share with other patients and say, based on your personal characteristics, this is what you can expect your outcomes to be. So we have a lot of work to do. And then, of course, monitoring devices that have reached the market. There's a lot of information that we could learn about safety. My clinical trial in particular, an adverse event would have been AFib. So you can guess what happens if you're having any type of arrhythmia and you go into your cardiologist's office, they hook up the 12-lead ECG and they almost never capture anything. So with our devices that can either be clinical grade or consumer devices, we're now starting to be able to capture that in real time and in the home. So patients don't have to come in, and it's much more reflective and accurate of like what my real world experience is living with that. And I also think it'll give us a much more accurate reflection of adverse events. And then you can also use this information in real world evidence packages to start differentiating medical products. And so it's important, a lot of the times I'll call these face valid measures. If a patient is moving better, if we're sleeping better, that helps us function better. And so providing that evidence is important when we want to make clinical decisions and treatment decisions with our healthcare providers. So these are just kind of some teaser snapshots to give you an idea of what you can do with this data. So on the left-hand side, this is an asthma example of people, if we're looking at just traditional sources of data, based on their clinical characteristics, they look exactly the same. But yet you can see that a patient, individual one, has actually, they've reported that they're not sleeping well, that they're waking up, a couple times a night. Well, what does that actually mean? When you have this objective data, we can see that this individual is only sleeping 49% of the time that they're in bed, while individual 2 is actually sleeping 98% of the time. And so you can guess in patient self-report, the person that's actually having the higher quality of life and feels and functions better is individual 2. But again, if we were just using traditional sources of data, we wouldn't be able to ascertain that. The next example that I wanted to share is from a study on continuous digital assessment after weight loss surgery. And so in the evidation cohort called Achievement, we had about 675 patients that reported undergoing a weight loss surgery that were also using a Fitbit. And then we grouped them into sub-cohorts based on people that we had data on for 24 weeks, so 12 weeks pre-procedure, 12 weeks post, that had no more than seven days of missing data in that period of time. And what I think is really important that you can see on the slide, I know the print is incredibly small, you can basically see that after recovering from the surgery, their resting heart rate started to drop in a month. It was 4 beats per minute, and within 12 weeks, it was 8 beats per minute, a resting heart rate drop. So that might be clinically significant. We can also see that sleep efficiency in the very bottom right quadrant, sleep efficiency improved. So how much of the night that the patient reported being in bed are they actually sleeping? And then the upper left, as we got further out from the weight loss surgery, their activity improved. And so they were taking 1,000 steps more post-procedure than pre-procedure. And so all of this data can be structured, and we can learn a lot more about recovery trajectories and then what is to be expected following medical procedures or implanting devices like lap bands. So there's tremendous opportunity when we start to use this person-generated health data. We can more frequently and sensitively start to measure what the patient's experience is living with a device outside of the clinic, or what the impact of that true condition is on their life and the symptom burden. We can start to have these novel insights about mobility, sleep, mood, pain, and certainly more. I love the opportunity this presents for people who can't report, or pediatric conditions, if we can use our sensors and start to develop some of these novel measures that are objective and passively and continuously collected. And then lastly, person-generated health data can be incorporated into our real-world evidence plans and really help us better understand the safety, the clinical benefit, and then also differentiate our medical products. Thank you.
Thank you for attending MDIC's annual public forum. We hope you will join us for next week's session for a discussion on new frontiers in access with real-world evidence development and an update on MDIC's health economics and patient value initiative. Visit apf.mdic.org for more information and to catch up on previous sessions.